Best of r/malicious compliance episode 23. Before uni I worked as a temp. One of the jobs I had was in a plastic recycling center. I was hired to fill plastic bags with plastic so it could be processed at a later date, but the plastic with which to fill the plastic bags with was a few weeks late, so as there was very little, well literally no work, for me to do, I was given various silly tasks, such as sweeping the entire empty warehouse, which was completely pointless considering it doesn't get dirty overnight, plus other completely pointless shit just to waste time. Add into this I had one co-worker who hated me from the second I got there and a miserable prick of a boss, and it wasn't an enjoyable job. After about a week we had a load of plastic tarpaulin mixed in with other shit and I was tasked with crushing it with one of these. It was a huge machine and took around a day of solid work to fill completely, considering you had to sort all the plastic out, and once it's filled you have to unload the machine by pulling the 300 kg bale out. As it's a fairly dangerous machine, it's not as simple as just opening a door to unload the bale, so the miserable prick of a boss comes over, opens the machine and starts trying to pull the bale out. I walk off to get my gloves so I don't rip my hands open helping get the bale out, and he says, "Oh, never mind, don't bother helping." So I said okay and went on my break and watched him struggle with it for the next 10 minutes before he used a forklift truck to pull it out. When he came back over, I don't think I've seen an angrier man. He tried to give me a bollocking, but I said I was following instruction and ignored everything he said, so he left me alone for the next couple of weeks I was there. Once the plastic arrived for me to fill, I decided to quit that day. 'Cause fuck it, they wasted my time so I wasted theirs. Thank you. Next. So this happened to my brother a while back when he was still in college in the early 2000s. He was talking to this girl who lived a few states away and they had been at it for a few months. He enjoyed talking to her and she seemed like a really cool person. Then, she asked him if he wanted to be girlfriend/boyfriend. He said sure, but in his mind, he didn't think it would really change anything. After all, it wasn't like they could go on dates or do anything together, though he had considered going to visit her during the break. Anyway, a few weeks go by and one day, he tells her that he's going to a party with his friends. She pauses and then asks him if there will be girls there. He says, probably 'cause it is a college party. She then immediately tells him he can't go if that's the case. Confused, he asks why and she just says that he can't go to parties where there are girls. Not one to take others BS. He just says that he's going to the party whether she likes it or not. She then responds by yelling that if he's gonna go then he shouldn't call her later. He responds with an enthusiastic cock and hangs up on her. He had actually been worried about not being able to call her later due to getting too drunk, so this was actually one less thing for him to worry about. The next morning, she calls him and asks why he didn't call her and he just reiterates what she said to him. "You said to not call you." They went back to just being friends after. Thank you. Next. I used to work for a company that has two different sets of working hours. The people who had been there over 4 years were on an older 36, 25-hour per week contract, but were allowed to take a day of flexi-time holiday per month if they had worked 7, 25 hours extra in the previous month. All of the newer staff were on a 35 hours per week flexi hours contract, meaning they could be flexible about their start and end times, but they didn't get an extra holiday per month. Both contracts cropped the number of hours you could carry over to the next month to 12 hours. I had been at the company for years and I was regularly over 20 hours in credit at the end of the month. Then I found out that my dad had terminal cancer, mesothelioma. I was devastated. He was all I had. My mum had died when I was a teenager. I had no siblings and dad lived 100 miles away from me on his own. I carried on at work because I was skint and quitting my job would have bankrupted me. I visited him as often as I could whilst trying not to take so many days compassionate leave so that when dad got really sick I could work from his house so I could be there for him. I called him daily to check in with him. I went home for Christmas and that's when I had discovered dad had been covering up how ill he had become. I put the working from dad's plan into action, went back to work to get a laptop and decided that I was working from home until the inevitable happened. He was rushed into hospital on December the 27th and he died on his birthday just over a week later, 6 months after he found out he was ill. It took me a couple of weeks to clear his house out. HR gave me 3 weeks compassionate leave to sort out his affairs, which was good of them. When I returned to work I had missed my yearly appraisal, so it was done a couple of days after my return. My manager went through my objectives and then said he wasn't happy that I had only been working my contracted hours for the past 6 months and that if I wanted to get anywhere in the company I would need to work extra hours to make the step up. Needless to say that didn't go down very well. I asked if he was serious and told him that he knew that for the past 6 months my only family member had been terminally ill but I had still stayed and hadn't taken advantage of the compassionate leave as much as I should have. I was fuming. Now, about a year before all of this, HR had offered to let us switch across to the flexi hours contract if we wanted, but we all refused because of the extra holidays we could take. I sent HR an email telling them I'd like to switch contracts. From that point forward I went from being 20-30 hours over per month on a 36-25 hour per week contract to being within an hour of my contracted hours on my new 35-hour flexi time contract. TLDR. My manager complained that I was only working my contracted hours whilst my only living family member was terminally ill, so I switched contracts and ended up working a lot less hours. Thank you. Next. I work for an aerospace manufacturing company. With some parts, we have a finite amount of time during the day to finish them. If you fail to finish within that window you basically have to restart. I'm also a student, so staying late to finish a part is rarely possible. I work on very large helicopter parts that very few or in some case no one else knows how to do. For a while I had it worked out with my supervisor that on days I had a lot to get done, I would work through my lunch and leave in time to make it to class. Within the past few months a new manager started and told me I was no longer allowed to skip lunch. It would be taken out no matter what, and they would no longer adjust my time accordingly. If I wanted to, I could stay late to complete my work. Okay, no problem. But I don't want to stay late, so for the next few weeks I clocked out for lunch every single day, and clocked out the minute my shift ended as well. As a result I started missing the time window to complete certain parts, and would clock out at the end of the day having not yet completed some work. Being a production company the manager started to feel the heat from this, especially from some unhappy customers who were no longer receiving their parts as quickly as they had been. Last week I got called into the office and was told that my manager had been thinking about it. After discussing it with my supervisor he divided as long as I'll let my supervisor know ahead of time I could work through my lunch and clock out early / on time as I previously had been. Okay, sounds like a good idea to me. Thank you. Next. This all started with my dad being offered a job, and a condition being that the boss sets me up with one as well. I was fresh out of school and was looking around for jobs, when my dad calls me and asks me to come for an interview for a delivery job. I quickly scatter off to the shower and make it there within 30 minutes. The boss, John, seemed to be nice and was supportive of me going to take a month of leave to study full-time for my truck license, YKB in Sweden/EU. After the interview, and signing the contract, I went to the restroom and overheard John chewing out a colleague of mine for something that was not his fault. I was hoping it was just a stressful day but boy was I wrong. I come back the next day to work. I meet up with my colleague who is temporarily driving the route I was going to have. He was here to train me and give me instructions etc. He tells me about the workplace and tells me that everyone hates John. Still, I wanted to make up my own mind on the matter and decided to mostly ignore the small talk. In all of the trucks, there are supposed to be papers showing all of the stops and rules for deliveries. There was none in this particular vehicle. We asked John if we could have one and he begins screaming at my coworker about how he's responsible for it even though he only had this route for a week, temporarily. After this, I promptly tell my boss the exact date of the course I told him about. Seeing as I only told him November through December the first time, he tells me that's a long time, but you can always postpone it. So it's fine. He knew the length of the course before getting my contract, and the course cost $3,600 and not refundable. I tell him this and he explodes. I decide to waddle out of there, but now he has this massive grudge against me. My father gets a new contract with his current company with a much bigger payout and decides to stick with it. This makes my boss even angrier at me. My boss then tries to mess with my hours and pay, holding back several $100s. which I got after talking to the economy department. After this, I realize I don't want to work here. He tells me he can offer a truck job after I get my license and I answer that yeah, that's good. Day after day, he chews me out for things not in my control, and begins to do everything legally in his power to make shit worse for me. So I do the same to him. As a delivery driver, I have to be nice to customers etc etc. One of the big things I did for the customers is holding out on my break to get there in time. I had to deliver everything by 7 AM, and I start my shift at 1 AM. Legally, I have to take a 30-minute break after 6 hours of work. The route was terribly planned and very often, I'd have just minutes left, or even worse, I'd be at the last stop by exactly 7. On one particular day, I was late because we had lots of goods to deliver. I had 3 stops when the clock strikes 7. So I take my break. Customers start calling, but I don't pick up, because I don't have to do so on my break. My boss calls me by the end of my break and complains about my deliveries not being in time. I explain that I was on break and he tells me I can always postpone it. I tell him no, I cannot do that because the law requires me to take a break at 7 AM. And he gets furious. The next day, a system-wide message gets sent saying we have to deliver by 7 AM because complaints have been coming in. We are about to lose a massive customer. This customer, which we deliver goods for, to their customers, was roughly half of the company income. The following 2 days was the same story. Lots to do and I take my break. My boss leaves 11 voicemails on my break, and I call him back when I'm back on the clock. He begins ranting on and on about how terrible I am and such. He tells me I can leave the keys when I get back, and never come back to the job. After my leave, a few co-workers calls me and tells me they resigned. The company now lacks half of the drivers and can't manage the workload by themselves. The company loses their biggest client, and promptly fires most staff before selling half the company to someone else. Last I checked, they're not doing too good, because John is still there and nobody wants to work there. Their reputation has spread. I've heard from everyone partaking in the same course as me that the company is a hellhole, and going downhill. Thank you. Next. Happened just a few minutes ago. I was driving to school along a pretty well-known shortcut in my area. This shortcut is through a one-way private residential road and as such has a 15-mile-per-hour speed limit and is a little thin as roads go. No room to pass. That becomes relevant later, but it's a little faster nonetheless. Most students drive a little faster through the road than legal, but the cops don't mind. We need to get to school. And they've been there. On to the story. This morning as I pulled into the road going a healthy 35 miles per hour, then this guy driving a jacked up truck whose music I can hear blasting out behind me over my own speed up right behind me, just a couple feet away with his brights on. Now normally someone driving behind me with their brights on is no big deal, I can just flick down the mirror and it lessens the glare. But because his car was jacked up higher than usual, no matter which way my mirror was flipped it shone directly into my eyes. A little miffed I flash my brake lights at him, hoping to solve both the lights and the following too closely with one stone. To my relief he turns off the brights. For about a second, just long enough that I know it's intentional before flicking them back on, and not slowing down at all. I'm a little mad and try flashing the brakes again to no avail. I conveniently pass another speed limit sign for 15 miles per hour. Now even speeding I'm going to be a little late for school and so is this guy. My first class is pretty lenient with late slips so I'm good to show up a little later. So I slow it all the way down to 15. Just kinda creeping along and he slams on his brakes to avoid hitting me. And after checking both sides he finds that he is unable to pass me. Naturally he starts to lay on the horn. And I simply crank my music up and chug along to school. As soon as we hit a regular road he roars around me, flipping the bird, and I give a friendly wave. I walk into class about 30 minutes late and am not sent for a late slip. Don't know what happened to the other guy though. I did see him park at the school however, so he was a student. Edit. We were both already late at the beginning if that wasn't clear. I just made it worse. Most teachers will waive off a few minutes but not a half hour. Thank you. Next. I work for a large company that can't seem to keep employees for some reason. Perhaps because breaks don't exist. So we are not allowed to sit at any time, emphasized by the fact that the only 2 chairs in our store is in the back room. One is a stepladder and the other is a folding chair kindly provided by a past employee. We are expected to stand waiting in the store for customers and maybe clean here and there. Fine. We are also severely understaffed. Shift overlap is between a few minutes to an hour, but you are not allowed to take a break within 1 hour of clocking in or out, and you can't combine breaks. So what I would do is clock out for my 30 and take my 15 separate with the store closed and leave a sign. They recently implemented a new strict rule that you are unable to close the store for any reason besides using the bathroom, buying food and bringing it back to work during your clock 30, limit 15 minutes, or to recruit, limit 1 hour, manager only. When you take a break, you have to leave the store open and watch the cameras, immediately exiting to help people who come in. Not sure about anyone else, but that doesn't sound like a break to me. So now instead of working my shift the way they wanted and closing for a total of an hour spread out, I now spend 3/4 of the day or more sitting in the back room working, coming out for customers. I also don't clock out for my 30, since I'm technically still on the clock watching the cameras. If I have to work on break, then I'll break when I work. TLDR, made a new rule that you had to work during your break, so now I only take breaks. Apostrophe.